Very good. All right. Briefly before we get to Manishana, last week I didn't talk about the Torah reading. We have two Torah readings that come to this time of year that, to be generous, are boring to most people. Tazria Mitzorah. When it's not a leap year, they're put together, maybe so we can get past them real fast. Ostensibly, when you read the old Bible translations, the major theme is leprosy. And that's what you'll hear, is that it's about leprosy, which is also known as Hansen disease. Okay? But when you read the accounts that you find in the biblical narrative of Tazria Mitzorah, it's soon very clear that this has nothing to do with leprosy. The aspects of what it is, the way it works, the fact that it talks about it being on clothing, it talks about it being on the walls of a house, make very clear that it is not what the world would consider to be leprosy in any shape or form. And the best way to understand it is that the rabbis sought to explain that this was a punishment that came about for something, so that it was understood by many of the commentaries, and or at least it's used this way for sermon purposes, if nothing else, for sermonics, that it's a punishment for lashon hara, for speaking evil of others, gossiping, passing tales around. And how is that related? The suggestion is, when you contracted tzarat, the Hebrew word for what it is, you were separated from everybody. People wouldn't have nothing to do with you. You had to warn people. You were in a ritual state of impurity. And when you speak bad and you pass gossip about people all the time, guess what happens? You end up usually being isolated because people don't want to have anything to do with you. Did you want to say something, Vivian?
Try to read this online.
All right. So they associated it that way. It isn't clear what the Bible necessarily meant by it, but it certainly is understood in that manner. And so it was viewed as a ritual impurity, and ritual impurity could be passed to others, so that's part of the reason why you are isolated, and then you went through ritual purification. There's no discussion about medication or anything like that in the passages. So unless you are a dermatologist, a lot of the details kind of just go this way. Although at the very beginning of the first parsha last week, Tazria, talks about childbirth and ritual purity and impurity following childbirth. And there we have, again, the mitzvah of the circumcision on the 8th day is repeated in that point. So that's really what we've been looking at right now. Now, of course, this Shabbat is called in Jewish tradition Shabbat Hagadol, the Great Sabbath. And it is always the Shabbat that precedes the holiday of Pesach. Why is it called Shabbat Hagadol? There are different attempts to explain it. But again, sort of a folkloristic kind of explanation. It's called Shabbat Hagadol because the rabbi gives a big sermon, a big speech Shabbos afternoon. Actually, it was on Shabbos afternoon. In medieval Europe, certainly, rabbis did not give sermons normally. You went to the synagogue, you had the service. There might be itinerant preachers called called a Maggid, who might speak from time to time. But the rabbi, the Rav, only spoke, or at least generally spoke in terms of the synagogues, twice a year. before Yom Kippur and before Pesach. And often these are very involved sermons, really learning sessions more than anything else. And so one of the popular devices was to say, on Pesach, what do we have to remove from our homes?
Chametz.
Chametz. What does chametz do? It causes you to puff up. All right, so you try to eliminate all kinds of things, especially the Yetzer Hara, the evil urge, along with the chametz when you're cleaning out your homes. And also, I don't remember if I mentioned the fast of the firstborn, right? Okay, that will be taking place Monday morning, and then the burning of the chametz and all those good things. All right. Also, I know I didn't go over it. The second night of Pesach, we start counting the Omer. It's called Sfirat Omer. The Torah speaks about counting the 50 days until we get to the holiday of Shavuot. And the explanation given was that the the day after the first Seder, second day of Pesach, they would bring an offering of new wheat to the temple. They made special chalot, special loaves, and that was the holiday of Shavuot. And it was also seen by the rabbis as connected with the giving of the Torah. So 7 weeks, 49 days, we count the Omer, and the 50th day is the holiday of Shavuot. And there was a very ancient argument as to when did you start counting the Omer? The wording used in the Torah is after the Shabbat, Chorat HaShabbat, the day after the Sabbath. What does that mean? Rabbinic tradition says that Yom Tov, the holiday, is also considered to be a Shabbat. And therefore they said the day after Shabbat, meaning the second day of Passover, that's when the Omer would be brought. And you started counting the Omer, starting that night, the second night of Passover, right? When we celebrate the second Seder, that night you start counting the Omer, excuse me. However, we know there was a debate even amongst the rabbis. We know that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's a witness to communities who counted Shavuot from the first Sunday after Passover began, or the first Sunday after Passover was over. And then they would count so that Shavuot would always fall on a Sunday. And the holiday is sometimes called in English Pentecost, which is 50. It's the 50th day. It's called Shavuot in Hebrew because it's weeks, the 7 weeks and the day after the finish of the 7 weeks. And during the Gaonic period, somewhere around the 700s, or give or take, we know this was a widespread custom that had developed of treating the time between the beginning of the Omer and Shavuot as a time of semi-mourning. Weddings weren't performed and different kinds of things were involved with it. And there were differences of opinion how you counted that. The 33rd day of the Omer was seen as a kind of semi-holiday. Again, all the origins of a lot of these things are kind of lost in the history. According to the tradition that developed, that Rabbi Akiva's students, for some reason, died during having a plague, something, and that plague ended on the 33rd day of the Omer. And so it became a time of celebration. It may have begun to die out a little bit until the time of the Crusades. And the Crusades took major warfare in the ancient world, and even still today in the modern world to a lesser extent, takes place when the weather's good, the dry season, so that the chariots don't get sunk in the mud like they did at the sea. And so this was the time of the Crusades, was at this time. So it was kind of reinvigorated, if we want to use that kind of terminology, because of the massacres that took place in Europe. And there are different customs that are followed today. Because one of the customs that you'll find that is widely observed in the observant communities is not to get haircuts or shaves during the Omer period. And again, it depends on how you count it. Some would count it from the very beginning. And so 33 days later, with Lag BaOmer, the day after Lag BaOmer, really you would get a haircut. Some start observing it from Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of the next month. And then Lag BaOmer was just kind of a break from that. And people get haircuts and have bonfires and celebrate like that. If you go to Israel, make sure you have no wood lying around during the weeks leading up to Lag BaOmer, because any kid who's worth his salt will try to grab any old wood lying around to make a bonfire. That's a popular way of celebrating Lag BaOmer in Israel, along with picnics. And so we will talk about Shavuot in the weeks ahead, but because we're coming up to, we won't be here till after Pesach, I wanted to take note of it. What do we do? Each night, we recite a bracha, a blessing, Asher Kiddushanu Mitzvotav V'Tzivanu Al Sfirat HaOmer, for the counting of the Omer, and we count Hayom Yom Echad LaOmer. Tonight is one day to the Omer, 2 days to the Omer. At the back of this, many of the Haggadot will have it in the back for the second night. Some do, some don't. It varies. This one have it? See it right up hand. Anyway, you will find it in the Sidurim, and the cards are given out, what have you. But the idea is that each one of us is supposed to count the Omer to fulfill the mitzvah. So we're supposed to count it the 49 days. And at the end of the week, Hayom Yom Shiva Yomim LaOmer Shem Shavua Echad. This is 7 days Omer, which is 1 day. Then the next day is Shmona Yamim Shehem Shavua Echad B'Yom Echad LaOmer. In the 2 weeks, 3 weeks, etc. And if you forget at night to count it, you can still count it till sunset the next night. If you remember by sunset the next night, then you keep saying the blessing. If you forget to say it one day, I missed this 3rd day of the Omer, I didn't count 3. You're still supposed to count, but you don't say the blessing. And another one of the great kunzes of Sfirat Omer, counting Omer, is as with most items, most things in Jewish tradition, right? We say the blessing, and then we perform the act. We say the blessing on reciting the Omer, and then we recite the Omer. What happens if you said the counting of the Omer first and forgot to say the blessing? You don't say the blessing because you've already counted. You don't do it after the fact. So you're never supposed to tell somebody what the date is. For example, if tonight's the 3rd night of the Omer, you said, Rabbi, what day do we count for the Omer tonight? I would tell you yesterday we counted 2. All right? So that I don't say the date, because if I haven't said the bracha yet myself, and you might repeat it and not say the bracha. So there's one of the things you never answer directly. You say what last night was. Last night we counted 2 days to the Omer. And if you can't add 1 day to that, then you got real problems. You'll never make it to the end of the counting. All right. But again, like I say, there are different traditions. Some follow no weddings until Lag BaOmer and then do weddings after Lag BaOmer. Some will do weddings up to Rosh Chodesh and then no weddings except on Lag BaOmer where they will do a wedding. In more liberal communities, using that term loosely, where they follow counting of the Omer restrictions, they might do weddings on Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israel Independence Day, as recognition of that being a celebratory day. And in many conservative synagogues, they really don't take much notice of the Omer restrictions at all. So it depends on the synagogue, the rabbi, and the community. In the Orthodox community, Omer restrictions are fairly well observed. In the conservative world, it just depends upon the synagogue and the rabbi and how they work with it. So if anybody here is planning on getting married between Pesach and Shavuot, you better find out if the rabbi's really going to be available. Just like the 3 weeks before Tisha B'Av, rabbis traditionally don't do weddings. All right? So there. Okay. Looking over my notes, I saw that I did not put in a lesson about the Holocaust. Do I have it on? What date did I have on the Holocaust? Because I think I rescheduled and I didn't get it. It got left out.
Oh, April 3rd.
April 3rd. All right, so that got cut out. Okay, so I'm going to combine, which I don't like doing to a certain extent, talking about Israel, Zionism, and the Holocaust. There's usually 2 full nights. We're going to abbreviate it into 1 full night, and some caveats when we get to it. But before we do that, take out your 4 questions. You haven't memorized it yet. All right.
Kind of.
No, who didn't know?
I'm kind of memorized it.
Uh-huh. All right. Well, everybody was warned last week. But anyhow, what can I tell you? Manishtana. Okay. So let's read very slowly for everybody. We will say Ma nishtana halayla hazeh mikol halelot shebechol halelot anu ochlin chametz umatzah halayla hazeh hulo matzah shebechol halelot anu ochlin she'ar yirakot halayla hazeh maror shebechol halelot ein anu matbilin afilu pa'am echad halayla hazeh shetei ve'amim shebechol halelot anu ochlin ben yoshvin uvein misubin halayla hazeh kulanu misubin. Okay, everybody got that? You ready for the saying at the Seder? All right, so
Yes, I'm ready.
yeah, I'm Sarah. It's assigned already. Well, you got kids, Edith. What can I tell you?
Yeah, we love singing to it.
Mommy, I need to talk to you tonight or to talk about what coming the second Seder. Everybody's taking care for Seders? Anybody still lacking a place to go to tonight's? I take from the silence and everybody's covered. Okay. First of all, when we talk about Zionism, we really should talk about two different ideas. One is the relationship of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. And you cannot pick up the Torah or most of the Tanakh without seeing that connection. Abraham is promised the land of Israel, Canaan as it's known then. That's the promise given to his descendants. When Moshe takes Israel out of Egypt, it's the ultimate destination is Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. Sefer Yoshua, the book of Joshua, talks about the conquest of the land of Israel. Shoftim goes over some of that and discusses the period of time before there was a monarchy. Then the book of Samuel and Kings talks the history of the monarchy, the two splitting of the kingdoms, and then finally the exile. But at the end, in Ezra and Nehemiah, we have the return to the land of Israel. We have psalms that are written about returning. Al Naharot Bavel Sham Yashavnu Gam Bachim, by the banks of the Babylonian River, on Naharot Bavel, the rivers of Babylon. We wept. They told us sing songs of Jerusalem. We said we can't. And if I'm jumbling these things all together, but if I forget Jerusalem, I may right hand wither. If I don't put Jerusalem at the chief of my thoughts and prizes. Throughout Jewish history, up till today, we still have in our tefillot and our prayers about the restoration of Zion. As part of the Messianic dream was always the idea of a restoration of a Jewish commonwealth, using the ancient terms of kingdom in Zion. That has never left the Jewish thoughts. The exception to that was when Reform began and they wanted to see Judaism as simply being a religion and disconnecting it from the idea of being a people. And the Reform movement in its earlier stages tried to cut that connection. That was restored later on, but the Reform were some of the leadership of the Reform movement were clearly anti-Zionists, as well as saying we don't believe in the restoration of Israel. They don't believe that there will be a return. Germany is our home, which a couple of generations after they said that, they learned to their chagrin that Germans didn't think it was their home. Right? But there's always been this thought. There have always been Jews who lived, except for short periods of time when they were expelled by the Romans, within the confines of the greater area of what is the land of Israel. Especially in the city of Jerusalem, in the cities of Tzfat and Tiberia, up in the Galil. No matter who ruled the land, whether it was the Romans, whether it was the Persians at a time, whether it was the Muslim conquests, the land of Israel was not a separate entity following the destruction of the Jewish state. It was at most a geographic division within the empire. The only time there has ever been, since the time of King David, a state, the whole country as a country has been under Jewish rule. And there has never been, I know this is, there's never been a Palestinian state, if Palestinian means the Muslim population. It was Palestinian because everybody lived there were called Palestinians, so that the Jerusalem Post was originally called the Palestine Post. And if you were born in Hadassah Hospital in 1947, you were born in Jerusalem, Palestine. Okay, just you were born in Tel Aviv, you were born in Palestine. Okay, but there were hesitancy found in the Talmud, fears of Jews rising up in revolt against the Romans. We find that in the Mishnah and reflected in the Talmud. So that there was a downplay on political independence. And Jews for centuries, while they thought about it, never really started a crusade to go conquer the land of Israel, never in the position to do so. And that was seen by some religious authorities as being something we had to wait for the Mashiach to come. When the Messiah comes, then we can restore Jewish homeland. But until the Messiah comes, we cannot do so. And that was the basis for some of the opposition in very Orthodox circles, and indeed to a large part of the Orthodox rabbinate before the founding of the modern state of Israel, to Zionism. That, and the fact that they saw Zionists as mostly being very secular and not really seeking a religious world. So if we don't have Zionism as a political construct until the 19th century. And certainly, I don't doubt that in part it was influenced by all of the nationalities seeking to reestablish themselves. Europe, at the beginning of the 19th century, you still the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The end of so we're still the 1700s, so the end of the 18th century, right? You still had the Hungarian Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire. You had the German Empire coming into being. You had Italy in a bunch of little different states. You had Greece under Turkish rule. You had all of the Slavic countries under Austro-Hungarian rule. And in the north, you had some conflicts as well of who ruled what. Norway, I don't remember how that all fit in together. I apologize. But with the 19th century, you begin to have people starting to think about their national identity, which for good or bad is what created the Europe that we know today. And all the conflicts that took place in Serbia and Yugoslavia and all those places. And there were the beginnings of kind of those thoughts amongst the Jews as well. But I'm not going to go through a semester of school's work of going over Zionism and its foundation. But I just want to start by noting that the circumstances of the Jews in Eastern Europe was terrible. And the pogroms in the 1880s, which drove a lot of Jews out to come to North America, to Canada, US, South Africa, all of these things set the beginnings of a movement that was not yet coalesced into a active format per se in the political realm. But you had groups gathering together, what they called Chivat Zion. And Chivat Zion was setting up pioneering methods. They were going to be pioneers in the Holy Land. They were planning to be farmers. And they trained for this. And between 1882 and 1903, we had what is known as the first Aliyah. Now, Aliyah means to go up. We use it in the synagogue. A person's called up at the Torah. They have an Aliyah to the Torah, go up. In Jewish tradition, we always talked about going to the land of Israel as aliyah, going up. So the first big, large movement was this aliyah, 1882 to 1903, in part because of pogroms, part of various other kinds of things that were going on. And they established some of the earliest rural settlements, moshavot. A moshav was a cooperative. There was a heavy socialist influence on these groups, which is also why some of them were not very religious or even anti-religious. Some 25,000, mostly Eastern European Jews, came to the land of Israel during this period. Now, this is when it's under Turkish rule. The Turks accepted them coming in. They allowed them to come in. Land was purchased, often from absentee landowners. They lived in Syria and Damascus and they owned land, and that's where some of these problems come about, because sometimes they sold land that had Arab villages on it. And the villagers had been renting the land, or they had been squatting on the land, and these settlers came in and they pushed them off. So that's some of the beginnings of the conflict, is already at the very early stages. But we need to remember and point out, this is not a governmental effort to colonize another country. I only now do I, after all the years that I've been teaching this, I've never had to talk about it in those terms, because now the world sees, or at least the left sees Israel as a result of a colonizing project by Europeans. Now, colonies in North America were that. England claimed rule over the colonies. Spanish colonies in the Americas were under Spanish rule. The French in Algeria were French colonies, etc. The home government ostensibly was in charge of this or oversaw it. This was not the case here. There was no government of any kind sponsoring it. At most, it was permission by the Turks to allow the settlers to come in to settle the land. So, you have a question? Yeah.
So how did they make contact with the owners? They had a real estate agent?
There are agents and things around, yeah. I don't know all the...
In Syria or...
Yeah, I don't know all the ins and outs, but yeah, they made arrangements to purchase land. All of the lands that were taken by these settlements were all purchased.
I get that.
Through whatever mechanism. Later on, when the Zionist movements, we actually haven't got to it yet, develops in the Jewish National Fund, then the land was being purchased often by the Jewish National Fund from the private owners, or, which was often the case, it was state-owned lands. It was owned by the Turkish government, by the Caliph, I guess, or the government, however they just divided it up. And as a matter of fact, a lot of the lands that were under dispute after 1948 was lands that were owned by the government. In that case, it would have been British under Turkish rule, that now fell to the hands of the new government that was in existence there, in this case, Israel. So, but it was important, this first wave of immigration was not motivated by the Zionist movement. So now we're going to turn to the creation of the Zionist movement. Again, I'm leaving out a lot of things. In 1894, Alfred Dreyfus, French Jewish army officer, we mentioned him last week, was tried for treason. Theodor Herzl, who was a correspondent for a newspaper back in Austria. What's the capital? I'm losing. Vienna. Thank you. Good grief. I keep getting older every week. All right. In Vienna, witnessed what went on. And, there's a lot of mythology around these things. So how much it affected him, how much he related to it. We do know that this was the time period when he began to seriously think that there was a need to solve the Jewish problem. Emancipation had not resolved it. Just like in the United States, the Emancipation Proclamation and the freeing of blacks from slavery didn't free and remove the race problems that existed in the United States. And so Jews were always up against this. And Herzl, as well as others, thought, well, maybe the way to do it was just simply assimilate, convert and assimilate into the world. But he began to see that wasn't going to take place. It wasn't going to be welcome. And he felt some Jews were not prepared to do that. So he felt that for those Jews, at least, who could not become part of Europe by just disappearing, needed some kind of homeland. And he wrote a work called the Judenstaat, the Jewish state. This became the basis for the creation of the Zionist movement. In 1896, he publishes this work, and he was calling for something different. He wasn't just calling for pioneers to go and create farming communities, what have you, but for immediate political action. And he helped to organize the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, August 29th through 31st, 1897. And the Congress adopted what's called the Basel Program and established the World Zionist Organization to help create the economic foundation for the proposed Jewish state. And Herzl was elected president, and he chaired the first 6 Congresses. He spent most of the rest of his life meeting with world leaders, both Jewish and non-Jewish, trying to enlist financial and political support for his dream of a Jewish state. And he died in 1904, very young, from a heart condition. So now you have these beginnings. The Zionist movement is coming into being. The World Zionist Congress is now an address to create some kind of organization. They adopted the Jewish flag. And they said in what they call the Zionist platform, they said that 4 means were resolved as necessary to secure a, quote, national homeland, right? Setting the land of Israel by farmers, artisans, and merchants, organizing and uniting all Jewry by means of local and general activity in accordance with the laws of each country, intensifying Jewish national feeling and Jewish national consciousness, and preparing to receive the consent of governments to realization of the Zionist goal. So it was a combination between Herzl's political activism, political Zionism, and the Chovevei Zion, the ones who were creating communities already, little farm communities. Amongst the decisions they made was the establishment of a national bank and a national fund for financing the activities of the Zionist movement. This became known as the Jewish National Fund. Most of the land in Israel is not under private ownership, but under the Jewish National Fund, and everybody rents for 100 years or whatever it is. So then with this background, then Herzl went around and speaking to various leaders. He met with the Kaiser, not very successfully. He tried to see the Turkish emperor, the Caliph. And there were various kinds of discussions going on. The original statement didn't say it had to be in the land of Israel. It was a Jewish homeland, but it didn't necessarily say that. So, for example, Britain in 1902 proposed what was called the El Arish. The Jews should settle in around El Arish in Sinai. Later, in 1903, when there were pogroms in Kishinev, the British government suggested Uganda. And the Zionist movement argued, is it better to take that, to create a Jewish homeland, not a country, homeland, or as most, in the way the final decision was, stick with Eretz Yisrael. So now, this what we call the second Aliyah, the first one having been there for a little while, not so successful, had problems. But the second Aliyah from 1904 through 1914, onset of World War I, it was a large, it was mostly coming from Russia and Poland. And as I said, in 1903, you had the Kishinev pogroms, as well as 2 years later. And a lot of these people were socialists. And they saw their efforts to create a workers' commonwealth in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel. And the young pioneers of the second Aliyah generally worked as hired laborers in the moshavot that had already been established, or the cities. And they established the labor parties, the first Jewish labor parties, Poalei Zion, Poel Hatzair. You can't have just one; you had to have at least two socialist parties with different angels. And they also led to the establishment of the first kfutza, the first kibbutz. The kibbutz was one of the few small letter C communist experiments that lasted for a fairly long time. It's pretty much gone away today, and there are still some kibbutzim around, but they're not what they were originally. These were true communal establishments. They had many of them. The children had a children's house. The parents had their own quarters, but the children were raised communally, communal kitchens, and all things like that. And this led to the foundation of the first new all-Jewish city, Tel Aviv, in 1909. And also, they introduced the beginning of Jewish self-defense against marauders of various kinds, and established the Hashomer Watchmen's Association, and the beginning of Hebrew being reborn as the language of the country took place during this time, especially under the influence of Eliezer ben Yehuda. Now, as always is the case, there were the newcomers and there were the old ones. There was what they called the new Yishuv, the new settlement, and the old Yishuv. The old Yishuv was mostly ultra-Orthodox, or lived in the holy cities of Tzfat and Jerusalem. Many of them lived basically off of charity. And they saw these newcomers at best barely Jewish at all. And sometimes they saw them as being anti-religious, as some of them were. And so there was conflict that began there between those two groups as well within the community. And so another factor of this was that many of the old Yishuvs, if they were of Arabic origin, spoke Arabic. If they were of European origin, they spoke Yiddish. And the newcomers wanted to speak Hebrew. And one was a very modern outlook on the world, centered around new settlements and Jaffa, Tel Aviv, while the older settlements was clearly the four traditional cities of Jerusalem, Sfat, Tiberia, and Hebron. Now, I mentioned Eliezer ben Yehuda. He's given the credit for modernizing Hebrew. You know, you take a language that has existed for thousands of years. It has one of the most famous literary works in the world, the Hebrew Bible. It has other works that are written in Hebrew, but it was not a spoken language. It had a limited vocabulary. A lot of things that came into being didn't exist when Hebrew was a vibrant, living language. I mean, there always were Jews who spoke Hebrew, but as a living new language, that was not the case. And so Eliezer ben Yehuda sought to create a new Hebrew language. He published newspapers in Hebrew. He coined words in Hebrew. A train, a rakhavet. Yes.
I just missed his name, sorry.
Eliezer ben Yehuda. That was not his original name, but Ben Yehuda was the name he became known by, he adopted. But he was given the credit for having created or modernizing Hebrew. And it's gone through lots of ins and outs. I get up every day from a program, the Hebrew word of the day. Half the time they're laughable. You have a picture, and then you say, "Do you know what the Hebrew word for this is?" So they had a gorilla, and what is the Hebrew word for gorilla? Gorilla. A whole bunch of words like that, and there's even still today. There's an academy in Israel that seeks to try and control the coining word, just like in France, right? So Lamach burger. There's a struggle. Some words work, some don't. Taklit was record. What was it? Radio. You know, I think Taklit was for radio too, but it became radio and telephone. So a lot of English influence. In fact, the British were there, and American influence throughout the world has poisoned Hebrew, but that's like every language in the world. But what has been retained and was a struggle was the Hebrew alphabet. You know, there was pressure to anglicize the alphabet. It might have made life a little easier for people coming to learn Hebrew, but in Israel, Hebrew is written only in the Hebrew alphabet. So we have these things going on, and then of course we have the outbreak of World War I. So Britain and her allies were fighting against Germany and the Ottoman Empire. Now, Russia was part of that alliance. So Russia was an enemy of Turkey. So a lot of these Jews who had come from Poland and Russia to settle in the land of Israel were regarded as foreign nationals, and some were expelled, like David Ben-Gurion was kicked out during that period of time. Others as well. There were Jews in the land of Israel who were anxious to get rid of Turkish rule, and there was a group of spies that helped the British. There were Jews who helped. First of all, of course, there were Jews in the British Army, and there was even a thing called the Zion Mule Corps, established by Joseph Trumpeldor, who had been in Israel, and this was in the British Army in 1916 as a separate group. Now, while the First World War, according to Woodrow Wilson, was not to maintain the old order, and we know the old order was being maintained the whole time. So if you ever really want to find out how the world's got such troubles today, read Paris 1919, which tells about the peace treaty of Versailles. All of the issues in Europe were created in 1919, really. There was a Sykes-Picot agreement, a secret agreement between the British and the French to divide the Middle East into separate spheres of influence. There would be a British sphere of influence and a French. The British would have Egypt and Palestine, and I don't remember for Liberia. Lebanon was on the British or French side. I don't recall. French. And Syria was under the French, and Iraq was under the British. Saudi Arabia was under the British. All these, they had divided it up. Nobody asked the local people. No one said, "You want to be part of our country? You want to be your own country? Do you want anything?" That they didn't bother doing. So in the meantime, the Zionists were working on the British, thinking that they would take part of the Turkish Empire. Turkey was the old man of Europe, was dying, and they were trying to influence the British government in favor of the creation of a Jewish homeland. And so on November 2nd, 1917, there was what was called the Balfour Declaration. Lord Balfour was part of the British cabinet, and it recognized the government was in favor of the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. All right. 1918, we have the conquest. General Allenby enters Jerusalem, and that was, again, 1917, excuse me. In 1918, Britain appoints a Zionist commission from within the Zionist leadership to advise them on implementation of Balfour Declaration. And in 1919, Chaim Weizmann, who was a chemist who had influence because he helped with the British war effort and some chemical issues with dealing with armaments. He led the Zionist delegation to the Versailles Peace Conference. But we already see again, that what might have been a nice start was also going to be threatened. In 1920, Tel Chai, which was a northern Galilean settlement, fell to Arab attackers, and Joseph Trumpeldor, who had helped create the Zion Mule Corps, who was leading the defenders there, was killed. And in those years, the British awarded the mandate over Palestine to Sir Herbert Samuel as High Commissioner. And the Histadrut, which was the Jewish Labor Party, which until the time of Begin and a little later was, in many ways, ran the country, the Jewish Union, Labor Union, and the Haganah, Jewish Self-Defense Forces. Now, towards the end of the war, with the following of the war, we had what was called the Third Aliyah, mainly from Russia. It was partially a continuation of the Second Aliyah. It was a part influenced by the Russian Revolution. It coincides with the British conquest of Palestine. It coincides with the fact that while that the immigration in the United States was still open, so the people coming at this time had choices. And most of them, therefore, came out of Zionist convictions. And in all, the Third Aliyah brought in something like 35,000 immigrants. mostly from Russia, Poland, and then the rest of the Middle East, Romania, Lithuania, Eastern Europe. 1921, there's riots in Jaffa, Arabs rising up against the Jews. The conflict is there. There is no Jewish state. But there's a fear that exists among the Arab population that the Jews are going to take over and kick them out. And even though the Jews were still a minority of the population, that was not something that they took in as meaningful. In 1922, the British mandate, right? So Britain had this mandate over Palestine. It was confirmed by the League of Nations, and the first of the partitions of the land of Israel takes place around this time. The Churchill White Paper, which was the first white paper, separates Transjordan from the area to be affected by the Jewish national home provisions of the Balfour Declaration and Mandate. In other words, mandated Palestine until then was everything that we know as west of the Jordan River, as well as all of what was and is today Jordan. That was divided. Jordan was everything east, everything west was to be Palestine. And so the Jews reluctantly accepted that. And then between 1924 and 1932, we have what's called the Fourth Aliyah, mostly from Poland. As my notes point out, it's a new wave of immigration, set in different social composition from its predecessors. There's been a drop in the inflow of pioneers, mainly because of restrictions on departure from Soviet Russia. On the other hand, there was a rise in the immigration of middle-class people, shopkeepers and artisans, mostly from Poland. And this was a result of two developments: the economic crisis in Poland and the severe limitations on immigration in the United States introduced in 1924. Now, the Zionist socialist movements had seen themselves as chalutzim, pioneers, workers. They were to rebuild the new Jew. They weren't going to be shopkeepers. They weren't going to be moneylenders. They were going to be the romantic vision of the peasant. These newcomers, they wanted to replicate the life they had. And so they didn't move to the settlements. They stayed in the towns, primarily Tel Aviv. They opened up workshops, factories, hotels, restaurants, and a lot of their investments were made in construction. There were rural development on the coastal plain. New villages based on citrus orchards were founded during this time. So this fourth Aliyah brought in something like 67,000 immigrants. And there were some who left because of the economic hardships that were in Palestine at that time. Now, as the country's developing, the institutions, 1924, the Technion, which was founded in Haifa, a wonderful technical university. Hebrew University was founded in 1925. And in 1929, we have riots breaking out, especially in Hebron. Jews were massacred. And the British sent what was called the Shah Commission to investigate and to see what was going on. And the Hope Simpson inquiry follows the recommendations of the Shah Commission in analysis of the land opportunities, which led to, in October, the Passfield, or second white paper, which was the first attempt at British disengagement from the Jewish home commitments of the Declaration and the Mandate. And it begins limiting immigration to the land of Israel. 1933 through 39 was called the Fifth Aliyah, initially from Poland, but later mainly from Germany and German-controlled territories. Over 250,000 Jews came on that Aliyah, which it's a huge number, and definitely affected the totality of the issue. And more than 164,000 entered legally, but many came in illegally, smuggled into it. The German and Austrian Jews, over a quarter of the total, made an important contribution to the progress of the Yishuv. They constituted the first large-scale influx from Western and Central Europe. The majority of them, some 80%, settled in the cities and towns, and their skills and experience raised business standards and improved urban amenities. Over half the newcomers made their homes in Tel Aviv. In Haifa, the construction of the country's first modern port was completed in 1933, while in Jerusalem, the Jewish neighborhoods were largely expanded. When you look at Jerusalem, you see there's the old city, and the old Yishuv was in there. There were some settlements outside of that, but that was Jerusalem. This is an expansion into Rehovot and Kerem, various areas around, which is now part of the city of Jerusalem. A high proportion of newcomers from Germany and Austria practiced medicine or one of the academic professions. Then they provided a majority of the musicians who performed the new Philharmonic Orchestra. And also at that time was a new type of immigration called Youth Aliyah. They were bringing in young kids to try to escape from Europe. On the eve of World War II, the Jewish population in Palestine was around 475,000, about 40% of the total population. Now, when Hitler comes to power, we begin to see a greater influx of illegal immigration of Jews to Israel. The British tried to prevent a lot of them from coming in. They were afraid that this was going to raise the ire of the local Palestinian population. There were ships set out, and there was blocks and back and forth. And I don't have time to go through all of that. But this is the onset of the Holocaust. And I want to take and move into the Holocaust for a few minutes because, well, two things. One, Israel does not exist because of the Holocaust. Israel was on the road to becoming before the Holocaust. The Zionist movement had nothing to do with the Holocaust. Did it affect history to some extent? Yeah, I'm sure it did. I'm sure that it might have meant greater difficulty for Israel to come into being. But Nazi Germany proved the necessity for Jewish homeland. First thing to remember, Hitler came to power through an election. He was leader of an anti-Semitic party, the Nazi Party. He was invited by the chancellor to create the new government. They were given, we won't go through the ins and outs. I don't remember all the ins and outs of the political circumstances. But originally, I'm sorry, it wasn't the president, Hindenburg, invited him to be the chancellor, which is prime minister. So in January 30th, 1933, Hitler was named chancellor by President Hindenburg. it was one of the strongest parties in Germany, even though it was not a majority. It had only won 33% of the votes in the Reichstag. But once in power, Hitler began the process of removing democracy. He convinced the cabinet to invoke emergency clauses of the Constitution, which permitted suspension of individual freedoms of press, speech, and assembly, special security forces, the special state police, the Gestapo, the stormtroopers, the SA, and the security police, the SS, murdered or arrested leaders of opposition political parties, communists, socialists, liberals. Then the Enabling Act of March 23rd, 1933, forced through a Reichstag already purged of many of the political opponents, gave dictatorial powers to Hitler. Okay, so step by step, all democratic. Yeah, but it was until they put really an end to democracy. And also in 1933, the Nazis began to put into practice their racial ideology. Now, this echoed the ideas popular in Germany as well as other Western nations well before the 1930s. The Nazis believed that Germans were racially superior, and there was a struggle for survival between them and inferior races. They saw Jews, Roma, and the handicapped as serious biological threat to the purity of the German race. Jews, who numbered around 500,000 in Germany, less than 1% of the total population, were the principal target of Nazi hatred. The Nazis mistakenly identified Jews as a race, defined this race as inferior, and they fostered hate-mongering propaganda that blamed the Jews for Germany's economic depression, for the failures in World War I. And new German laws forced Jews to quit their civil service jobs, university and law court positions, and other areas of public life. And in April 1933, a boycott of Jewish businesses was instituted. 1935, laws proclaimed that Nuremberg stripped German Jews of their citizenship, even though they retained limited rights. These Nuremberg laws defined Jews not by their religion or by how they wanted to identify themselves, but by the blood of their grandparents. The Nazis settled on defining a full Jew as a person with 3 Jewish grandparents. Those with less were designated as Mischling of 2 degrees. First degree, 2 Jewish grandparents. Second degree, 1 Jewish grandparent. And so, you were defined by birth. Your grandparents were Jewish, at least 3 grandparents were Jewish, you were a Jew. When it came time to send people to concentration camps, they didn't care what religion you professed. As long as you met their rules, you were a Jew. So between 1937 and 1939, new anti-Jewish regulations segregated Jews further, made daily life very difficult. Jews could not attend public schools, go to theaters, cinemas, or vacation resorts, or reside or even walk in certain sections of German cities. Between 1937 and 1939, Jews were forced from Germany's economic life. They either seized Jewish businesses and properties outright, or forced Jews to sell them at bargain basement prices. November 1938, this economic attack against German and Austrian Jews changed into the physical destruction of synagogues and Jewish-owned stores, the arrest of Jewish men, the destruction of homes, and the murder of individuals. This centrally organized riot pogrom became known as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Now, as I said earlier, the Nazis didn't single out just the Jews. Others, like I said, the Roma were considered inferior. Hitler was deeply embarrassed in the Olympics in 1936 when Jesse Owens, representing the United States, won several events. Somehow he managed to not be there to congratulate the winner. But there was not a large Black population in Germany at that time, but they would have felt the brunt then as well. Now, Nazi racial ideology was buttressed by scientists who advocated selective breeding, eugenics, to improve the human race. Laws passed between 1933 and 35 aimed to reduce the future number of genetic inferiors through involuntary sterilization programs. About 500 children of mixed African-German racial backgrounds and 320 to 350,000 individuals judged physically or mentally handicapped were subjected to surgical or radiation procedures so they could not have children. Supporters of sterilization also argued that the handicap burdened the community with cost of their care. Many of Germany's 30,000 gypsies were eventually sterilized and prohibited, along with Blacks, from intermarrying with Germans. Reflecting traditional prejudices, new laws combine traditional prejudices with new racism of Nazis and define gypsies by race as criminal and asocial. And not only Jews, but political opponents, trade unionists, anybody who was an enemy of the state, according to the Nazis, were arrested, subject to sent to being concentration camp. The first one outside of Munich. Not remember the name in 10 minutes. Jewish leaders and other political leaders were sent to this first concentration camp. Some of them were let out later on, but it was the beginning of what was going to be. Jehovah's Witnesses were attacked, lost jobs, sent to prison and concentration camps. So the first systematic roundup of Germans and Austrian Jews, which occurred after Kristallnacht, when approximately 30,000 Jewish men and several hundred Jewish women were sent to Dachau, that was the camp I was thinking of, and other concentration camps. At the end of 1938, the waves of arrests included several thousand German and Austrian gypsies. Between 1933 and 1939, about half the German Jewish population and more than 2/3 of Austrian Jews fled Nazi persecution. They emigrated mainly to Palestine, the United States, Latin America, China, Eastern and Western Europe. And those who remained were either unwilling to uproot themselves or unable to obtain visas. Most foreign countries, including the United States, Canada, Britain, and France, were unwilling to admit large numbers of refugees. So now between 1939 and 1945, the Second World War, Germany invaded Poland and the war began. Within a month, the Polish army was defeated, and the Nazis began their campaign to destroy Polish culture and enslave the Polish people, whom they viewed as subhuman. Killing Polish leaders was the first step. German soldiers carried out massacres of university professors, artists, writers, politicians, and many Catholic priests. To create new living space, living room for the superior German race, large segments of the Polish population were resettled, and German families moved into the emptied lands. Thousands of other Poles, including Jews, were imprisoned in concentration camps. The Nazis also kidnapped as many as 50,000 Aryan-looking Polish children from their parents and took them to Germany to be adopted by German families. Many of them were later rejected and sent to special children's camps where some died of starvation and typhus. The abuses that took place, killing of incurable patients, killing of mental patients, of euthanasia, all these things were part and parcel of the Nazi regime. And now, as German forces continued their conquest of Europe and spread over France and then towards Russia. They began systematic murder of Europe's Jews. Mass executions, these usually carried out improvised sites throughout the Soviet Union by members of mobile killing squads, the Einsatzgruppen, who followed in the wake of invading German army. The most famous of these sites was Babi Yar near Kiev, where an estimated 33,000 persons, mostly Jews, were murdered by shooting. In Ukrainian today, it's not pronounced Babi Yar. I forget the, you have to figure it out, but it's still noted there. So now, as more and more Jews are rounded up and prisoners are rounded up, they had to create new camps throughout Eastern Europe and some in France as well, in Germany. Jews were sent, many to Jewish communities. The city of Lodz, for example, where a lot of Jews in this community came from. There's a Lodzer synagogue, Lodz Holocaust synagogue that was founded by survivors from Lodz, or people came before the Holocaust. Warsaw had a very large ghetto. There, following the invasion of Poland, 3 million Polish Jews were forced into approximately 400 newly established ghettos, where they were segregated from the rest of the population. Large numbers of Jews were also deported from other cities and countries, including Germany, to ghettos in Poland and German-occupied territories further east. The crowding, the lack of food, the exposure to cold, disease killed tens of thousands of people in these ghettos. You can see videos, you can see pictures of what it looked like, people dead on the streets. Sometimes they were used for labor, road gangs, and of course that would be hard labor. They died from exhaustion, maltreatment. Between 1942 and 1944, the Germans moved to eliminate the ghettos in occupied Poland and elsewhere, deporting ghetto residents to extermination camps, killing centers equipped with gassing facilities located in Poland. After the meeting of senior German government officials in late January 1942 at a villa in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee, the decision to implement, quote, the final solution of the Jewish question became formal state policy, and Jews from Western Europe were also sent to killing centers in the East. The 6 killing center sites were chosen because of their closeness to rail lines and their location in semi-rural areas: Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Chelmno, Majdanek, and Auschwitz and Birkenau. Chelmno was the first camp in which mass executions were carried out by gas piped into mobile gas vans. 150,000 people were killed there between December 41 and March 43, and June to July in 1944. Belzec also had gas vans and later gas chambers where more than 600,000 people were killed. Sobibor opened in May 1942 and closed one day after the rebellion of the prisoners on October 14, 1943. Up to 200,000 persons were killed by gassing. Treblinka opened in July 1942 and closed in November 1943. A revolt by the prisoners in early August 1943 had destroyed much of the facility, and at least 750,000 people were killed at Treblinka. Almost all of the victims at Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka were Jews. A few were gypsies. Very few individuals survived these 4 killing centers, where most of the victims were murdered immediately after arrival. You can see the videos of the trains coming in, the sign over with in German, Arbeit macht frei. There would be over the entryway, which means work, it makes you free, which was obviously not going to be. And it was horrible treatment on every level. Even those who were not gassed or beaten to death, starved to death, died from typhus, died from overwork. And in the end, roughly 6 million Jews were killed by the German extermination machine. Now, it's kind of an interesting sidelight. Between May 14th and July 8th, 1944, Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz. Now, Hungary, even though an ally of Germany, had protected their Jews. Now, they didn't have a good life there. There was anti-Semitism, but for whatever reason, the Hungarians did not want to let the Germans do this until then. And so 48 trains carried Jews from Hungary to Auschwitz and Majdanek. And at least 275,000 people were killed in the gas chambers or died from malnutrition, brutality, and disease. Now, there was resistance of some sorts. One of the questions that people sometimes at times ask, why didn't the Jews do something? Now, there are a couple of answers to that. One answer is just shock. You can see the various movies, Hollywood versions and the real ones. You got the Germans armed, they got dogs, they're rounding people up. If you resisted, you're beaten. Your children are there. You know, what are you going to do? By the time you get to the concentration camps, you're weak. People were crowded onto cattle cars without food, without water, without any ability for sanitation. And people died in the cars. You round it up. But but despite that, the fact remains that there was some resistance. Almost every concentration camp and ghetto of Europe had some kind of revolt to some extent. We mentioned Sobibor and Treblinka. The Warsaw Ghetto famously led to an uprising in April-May 1943, which proved to be a very heroic uprising. They have little arms, mostly Molotov cocktails and a few pistols and what have you. And while they looked for help, no one outside of the Warsaw Ghetto really gave them any help. The partisans were sometimes anti-Semitic themselves. Some had Jewish partisans, but the calls to the world to do something, to bomb the train tracks, was ignored or said to take away from the war effort. There was calls to do something to help the revolt at Warsaw. Nothing was done. And as the war turned, the Germans began to try and wipe out the memory of this. They tried to evacuate outlying concentration camps, cover up the evidence of genocide, deporting prisoners to camps inside Germany. Many died during the long journeys on foot, known as death marches. And the conditions in the remaining concentration camps exacted a terrible toll on human lives. Even concentration camps never intended for extermination, such as Bergen-Belsen, became death traps for thousands, including Anne Frank, who died there of typhus in March 1945. In May 1945, Nazi Germany collapsed. The SS guards fled, and the camps ceased to exist as extermination, forced labor, concentration camps. However, some of the camps were turned into camps for displaced persons, which included former Holocaust victims. So that's just a very brief overview of it. The world did virtually nothing. It allowed it to take place. When it became known there were attempts to rally. There was attempts to get the Vatican to do something. According to most authorities, Pope Pius, whatever number it was, 36, whatever the number, was only more concerned about protecting the Catholic Church's interests than saving Jews. He did ask to try and save some Jews who had become Catholics, but that didn't work. In fact, he was a Jewish nun who was recently beatified or canonized, whatever, who was she was a Jewish background. She became a nun and she was murdered in the camps too. I wish that it was a one-off event in human history, but the reality is it's not so one-off. Yeah. Now, Edith was posting that there's a book called Hannah's Suitcase that talks about the Holocaust. There are lots of books and things out there about the Holocaust. A famous fictionalized version of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, Mila 18 by Leon Uris was written. There was the movie by Schindler's List, Steven Spielberg. There were here and there people who risked their lives, Germans, Poles, every nationality, to save Jews. That has to be remembered. There were peoples of various different nationalities who turned Jews into the Nazis as well, who worked with them. So that has to be remembered as well. And it's a black eye on all of Europe. In recent years, the Poles have been trying very hard to whitewash. I'm not saying the Poles in general were responsible. There were Poles who were, and that should be known. The camps were German-made concentration camps, and so the Poles don't like them being called Polish concentration camps. They're only called Polish because of where they were, not because the Poles created them. So I understand the sensitivities. You have the sensitivities in the Ukraine. There were Ukrainians who cooperated with the Nazis. After all, they hated the communists. Many of the communists, unfortunately, were of Jewish background. So you were either a Jew who was a communist, or you were a Jew who was something else evil. So they cooperated that way. So those things existed. They shouldn't, it doesn't mean everybody today bears blame, but it does mean there's a history that should not be erased. So now, by the time the war is over, 6 million Jews are dead. Several million Jews survived. Several, not a lot. And the effort to save them fell in some ways to Jewish efforts. Now, some Jews were allowed into Canada and the United States. There was a large influx of Holocaust survivors to Canada. We mentioned that last week. We talked about Canadian history. But the Jewish community in Israel wanted to do something. So now, as with all things, and I skipped a lot of this, amongst the Jewish community in Israel prior to the war, some Jews joined up in the British Army. We had different Jewish undergrounds, like Lehi, which was one of the most extreme, led by Avraham Stern, split from Ben-Gurion's Haganah. and they sometimes fought with each other. But in 1941, the Palmach was created. Palmach became the forerunner of the Israel Defense Forces. And it was associated with Ben-Gurion and the Ben-Gurion group. And during the war, they sought to help the Allies. Palmach members were parachuted behind enemy lines in Europe and helped in the efforts there when they could. But the Jewish Brigade was formed as part of British forces during World War II. But after the war, things began to get a little more iffy in Eretz Yisrael. In July 22nd, 1946, well, before that, those Jews who were not legally allowed to emigrate to Israel were being deported to Cyprus and set up in what can be loosely defined as concentration camps. And so the Irgun, Etzel, trying to stop this, famously blew up a wing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. According to their members, they made a phone call warning it was going to happen. According to the British authorities, they got no warning. And then later on, Etzel hung 2 British sergeants in revenge for British death sentences on Etzel members, tit for tat kind of thing. The Transjordan became independent as the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. So now there is conflict. The Yishuv, the Jewish community, is trying to bring in refugees. British are blocking that. Arabs are afraid that they're going to be overwhelmed. They don't want a Jewish state there. They fight, their skirmishes, what have you. And so the British finally decide they've had enough of this. And so they turn it over to the United Nations, the successor to the
League of Nations.
League of Nations, thank you. Both Jews and Arabs were opposed to British rule. And in 1946, the Anglo-American Inquiry Commission recommended immediate immigration of 100,000 refugees. And recommended revoking the lands law and set down the white paper as well. The British rejected these suggestions and refused to implement them. So finally, the 11-member United Nations Special Committee on Palestine resolved that both Arabs and Jews should be granted full independence and that Jerusalem should be internationalized. On the night of November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly took a vote on approving the Palestine partition plan. You can find online what this looked like. Where were areas that were majority Jews, that would be part of the new Jewish state. Where it was majority Arabs, that would be part of the Arab state. And since Jerusalem was a special city for Christians, they weren't going to let Muslims and Jews or Jews run it, so it would be internationalized. So there was this vote that took place in the United Nations, and everybody's listening carefully to see what the final vote would be. And finally, indeed, they voted for partition. Now, this was a long way from what had been Palestine under the Balfour Declaration. Mm-hmm. But the Jewish community accepted, and riots so broke out in many cities, especially those with mixed populations. Jews in more isolated neighborhoods fled to other Jewish neighborhoods, and many Arabs left for nearby Arab countries. And outbreaks of violence occurred against Jews in Arab countries. When the Arab attacks began, the Haganah decreed that no settlement was to be abandoned, no matter how small. It was necessary to maintain a presence at all costs, since the borders of the state would be determined not by the partition plan, but by the ceasefire lines. And they knew at the beginning. whatever the United Nations had said, it didn't matter. What you had the strength to hold on to, that would be the end. I won't go over the war. There's some wonderful books written about that. Eventually, you have the beginning can be described as civil war. You have the Jews of Palestine, and you have the Arabs of Palestine, and they are struggling with each other from the moment this partition plan in May was voted on in 1948, and the Jewish community with under Haganah was fighting back. So the back and forth. So May 1948 until March of 1949 was this first beginning. So now on the Friday, the 5th of ER, 5708, May 14th, 1948. Although a lot of governments and countries were recommending they not do anything, David Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of the State of Israel. Right? This was the final end of the mandate, and the State of Israel came into being. And that the next day, we have invasion by Arab armies. The Egyptians invaded along the coastal plain, aiming for Tel Aviv, and fortunately, eventually it was stopped near Ashdod. The Syrian army attacked Dagania in the north, was pushed back in the battle of supreme heroism. It succeeded, however, in conquering the area of Mishmar HaYarden. The Lebanese overran the Malchia area and reached Nazareth. The Jordan army succeeded in cutting off Jerusalem from surrounding settlements. The Etzion bloc was defeated in the south, Beit HaRava in the east, and Neve Yaakov and Tarot in the north. But the most tragic defeat was the fall of Jerusalem's Jewish quarter on May 28, 1948. On June 11th, 1948, a temporary ceasefire came into effect. It lasted 4 weeks, during which time both sides regrouped and re-equipped their forces. On July 9th, 1948, the fighting resumed. Within 10 days, the Israeli forces managed to block the Egyptian army, reopened the road to Jerusalem, and staged several operations that succeeded in connecting Jewish-held areas in the city. In the lower and western Galilee, they retook large areas. Despite these efforts, the Negev remained cut off, and in 10 days of fighting, all attempts to link up failed. On July 19th, a second ceasefire was arranged, but the Egyptians contravened the ceasefire agreement, and in the fighting that ensued, the Negev was liberated. Without going through all the ins and outs of the fighting, one thing you have to understand, there is debate as to the Arab populations that lived in what became the State of Israel before 1967. It's clear that 3 things happened. One thing that happened was that some Arabs fled to get away from the fighting, and even were encouraged by the Arab armies to flee so they could come back after the fighting was over. Some Arabs were attacked by Jewish forces because of the strategic location of the villages. If you've ever been to Israel and gone up to Jerusalem, you go up this road up to through the mountains, and The problem was on either side of the road, on the hillsides, were villages which could take shoot up convoys coming through. They had makeshift tanks. They had trucks that had iron welded onto them. They used to have them still lying by the roadside, at least until a few years ago, until they finally made a road around and got to liberate at least the western part of Jerusalem. So you couldn't have those villages there. It was just not safe. It was just not safe. And you couldn't trust, you couldn't know who was going to be. So yes, they were pushed out of those villages. And yes, there were probably a couple of episodes in which Jews massacred local inhabitants. Not to forget, there are many events when Arabs massacred Jewish inhabitants. And wars like these are always bitter. But what was unusual about it was that the Arab refugees who fled, some were in the area of the Jordan Valley, what was called the West Bank. Of course, the Jordanians came in. That was supposed to be a part of the Palestinian state. So the Jordanians conquered it. They did not give rights to the Palestinians there. Palestinians who fled to Jordan were not given rights. They were made into refugees by whatever reason and were kept as refugees for political reasons. The only refugee agency that has been around forever is UNRWA. And it was defined someone as a refugee if they were children of refugees or children of refugees, children, going through the generations. So that has been a thorn in the side of the world. Nothing was done. The Jewish state struggled, brought in 800,000 Jews from Arab lands who were often kicked out. So you really had an exchange of populations. Arab population from what became Israel and Jewish population from Arab nations. It was a cold ceasefire, meaning it wasn't always fighting, but there was always something going on to some extent. Jerusalem was a divided city. The areas of Jerusalem that were supposed to be protected, the synagogues in Jerusalem, were destroyed. Jews were not allowed to visit the holy places, which was part of the armistice agreement. Comes 1967, the Six-Day War. Excuse me, let's go back. 1956 was the Sinai campaign. One of the agreements was that the Israeli state was to be allowed passage through the Suez Canal. The Egyptian government nationalized the Suez Canal. The French and British invaded to seize the canal. Israel, feeling it was in war, invaded and took over Sinai. The U.S. said to everybody, get out of there, and everybody did. There were peacekeepers. No, I'm going a little late. On the borders of Israel and Egypt, and in the north between Israel and Syria and Lebanon, and on the east with Jordan. Nasser was making noises. He told the UN to get out. He was closing off the Straits of Tiran, which would block Israeli traffic, which is again against what was part of the agreement, which blocking passage is an act of war. And Israel attacked Egypt. And in 6 days, because of the overwhelming air power, they were managed to destroy the Egyptian Air Force and push the Egyptian army to the other side of the Suez Canal. And in the north, they pushed back against the Syrians and took over what is known as the Golan Heights, which was always an area of dispute between the British and French. They had asked King Hussein of Jordan to stay out of the fighting. He believed the Egyptian propaganda that they were winning the war. He started shelling Israel, and Israel quickly took over what's called the West Bank in the old city of Jerusalem. And in many ways has redone the old city, created a plaza for the Kotel Maravi, and repopulated the Jewish quarter and rebuilt synagogues. Since 67, there has been two thought ideas within the Israeli elect population: give back part, hold on to everything. This is the coming of the Messiah. Don't be foolish. Let's back and forth. 1973, the Yom Kippur War, the Egyptians were able to surprise Israel and cross over and really threaten Israel, so as did the Syrians in the north. But Israel, again, was able to overcome, although at steep cost, even crossed the Suez Canal to the other side and had the Egyptian army surrounded. And finally, when they finished, they moved back on the other side of Sinai. Eventually, so now this was under Elnor Sadat, and it gave the Arabs a sense of victory. They were able to beat the Israelis, at least at the beginning. And maybe that's part of the psychology which enabled him to reach a peace treaty with Israel, as did the Jordanians. And slowly we've been seeing this going on. Those who are violently anti-Israel, Hamas, we know what they're like, and we've seen recently in our last few months what can transpire. Now, Israel pulled out of Gaza several years ago. It had nothing to do with running internally Gaza. When Hamas took over, elected by the population, they then got rid of the PLO and took over completely. But Israel stayed out, but was blocking material coming in that could be used for military purposes, in which we saw the result of that they did get through. And so we have very bitter fighting going on right now, still going on. And it's a result of the fact that, yes, there are some Israelis who want everything. I don't deny that. It'd be stupid to deny that. Are there Israelis who are anti-Arab? Of course, there are people like that. But in general, the Israeli population had just wanted to be left alone, wanted peace. The Arabs refused it. They had a commitment in 1995 at Oslo to create something. It just never worked. Our vision of it, the Israeli vision of it, is that they won't take yes for an answer. They wouldn't take a Palestinian state that they could have had in 1995 because they wanted everything back. And when one says from the river to the sea, they mean everything from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea should be Palestine under a Palestinian rule. And you can imagine what that would be like after seeing what they've done with Gaza. And, you know, that's where we are today. I might say a few more words next time, but it's really quite late already. I should let you out by now. Any quick questions? Anybody got to say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Given the socialist roots at the outside of Israel with formation, how does that branch or that degree of communism compared to the communism in Russia and China? Golda Meir was a socialist.
They were socialists, but there was a big difference. First big difference was that, again, you got exceptions to the rule, but in general, the socialists and communists of Israel were democratic. Yeah, when Stalin came along, he had his apologists amongst the socialists in Israel as well, but there was never an idea that they could take over the country and run it when there was a socialist, until Begin's time, the government was basically socialist, but it was free enterprise to plenty that always existed alongside. You had the kibbutzim, you had the moshavim, and you had a lot of pro-labor rules and regulations, but it was still a capitalistic system for the most part. And since Begin came to power, the far left for sure has been wiped out in Israel in terms of politics. There was a very strong, what we would call a peace camp that wanted to give back everything. Time has proved that just doesn't seem to work. And so even the most left-wing of the Israeli parties today are very hesitant to see the two-state solution come into being. They don't know how it can come about. But politically, economically, Israel is very much a capitalistic state today. Entrepreneurship is very important there. Technology is important there. Technological innovation is important. But for the first generation, the kibbutz spirit, the earliest leaders of the Israeli nation were from kibbutz backgrounds. They were from the kibbutzim. They were the heroes of the day. Today, that's no longer the case. It's a broader opening for heroes. Anybody else? Mm-hmm.
Wishing everyone a Hag Kasher Sameach.
Yes, Edith. I'll be in touch with you. We'll give you a call later and talk to you about.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Laila Tov.
Hag Sameach.